walking in a country road, and I've been chasing after my shadow.
Welcome back to the Camino Podcast, episode 111. I'm Dave Whitson.
Nobody asked me my name.
Apologies for a bit of a lag in production. The mini tour of California with Sandy Brown was an absolute delight. We were the beneficiaries of amazing pilgrim hospitality all the way down the coast, and it served as a vivid reminder of the amazing work being done by the chapter coordinators of American Pilgrims on the Camino in building pilgrim community at home. If you're not already connected to a chapter, whether with the American Pilgrims in the US or the equivalent Friends community in your own country, consider reaching out. Nobody understands your experience on the Camino quite like another pilgrim does. And nobody wants to hear about it more either. Speaking of fellow travelers, I was immediately drawn to Johannes Schwarz, a Catholic priest originally hailing from Austria, because he's a practitioner of what I think of as mega pilgrimages, walks that extend for months at a time. In fact, for as many kilometers as I've pulled in recent years, Johannes's journeys put mine to shame. Or to flip the saying on its head, make it more accurate, his journeys turn mine to admiration. There's enough material to draw upon to fill a dozen different pilgrimage episodes easily. That's no exaggeration. If anything, it sells him short. So I had to be selective in this conversation. I decided to focus on his 2022 pilgrimage on the Via Colombani. Technically, the route proceeds from Ireland to Italy, but that understates just how circuitous the journey is, as it even includes a full loop-de-loop in France. This was an easy choice to focus on because I just finished Schwartz's book, Following Columban, about that journey. And also because on my own Italian walk, I stumbled across the final destination of the Via Colombani and of Columban's own life's journey. Bobbio, Italy, is a small village tucked into the Trebbia Valley in the Piacenza Apennines. In addition to the Via Colombani, the Via degli Abbati passes through Bobbio, the latter a possible alternative branching off the Via Francigena. On the day I arrived, I found the town in festa mode, with a sock hop of all things taking place in the piazza outside the Duomo. Folks dressed in 1950s Americana were dancing, and crazy enough from an American perspective, the General Lee, an orange Dodge Charger from Dukes of Hazzard with a Confederate flag painted on top, was parked right in front. As the afternoon moved along, the dancers took the show on the road, boogieing up and down the side streets as the crowd wedged in around them. In any case, it was a memorable day. And that was just an early stop on my southward journey across Italy. For Johannes, it concluded a 4,000-mile pilgrimage. He completed the walk, but felt in the end like he had failed in his pilgrimage goal. In the conversation that follows, Johannes talks about how he got started as both a priest and a pilgrim, the larger vision behind his pilgrimages, some lessons we can take from Columban and his fellow monks, and why he determined that he fell short on his journey. I hope you enjoy. Johannes Schwarz is a Catholic priest from Austria, a prolific pilgrim, and the author of several books on his long-distance journeys, including Following Columban, a pilgrim's 4,000-mile quest for monks, meaning, and the meaning of monks, as well as Via Alpina Sacra, the longest pilgrimage across the Alps. He can be found online at 4kmh.com. Johannes Schwarz, thank you very much for speaking with me about your book, Following Columban, and your extensive life of walking. And I think I could spend the whole conversation just diving into your background alone. There's hints and references to things that you did in the years leading up to this walk that I'm curious about, but I'm going to stay focused. You are a priest. At what point did you know that this would be your vocation and an integral part of your identity?
The priesthood or the walking?
The priesthood, yeah.
Well, in a way, it has to do with my first long walk because I had planned my first long walk, and that was the walk to the Camino to Spain from my home in Austria back in the 90s. I was a wee lad of 20 years with long hair and the desire to see what this relationship with God would look like. And so I decided to walk to Spain. No money, no backpack, in a almost like a monastic outfit that my mom made for me based on a carnival costume. So you get the idea of how I moved through. I'm an incredibly romantic person, so that also meant that I took the shearer to my hair, and after the first few miles, I came to the river Danube, close to which I grew up, and I took this bundle of hair and I ceremoniously chucked it into the waters, saying, "Farewell, old self," and the new me was about to begin. So I have this pathetic gesture, the drive to have these grand pathetic gestures. And I'm using the word pathetic in its double sense, in its modern sense, and it's in the sense of pathos, which is these grand gestures. And I did so because I wanted to see what it looked like if I removed all the certainties and all the securities. No money, not knowing where I would bed down for the night, where I would sleep. And I slept in stables, at train stations, in seating of football stadiums, out in the hay, or even in hotels where people invited me in. So it was an incredibly formative journey that took me to Santiago back then to sort of figure out if that was the path that I was going to take. So I had my religious conversion, if you want. So I was, I'm Austrian, so most Austrians grew up back in the day, grew up in the Catholic faith. That was sort of the given thing, the cultural norm, but it was not practiced necessarily widely. I have some very pious souls in my family history. I had a great grandmother. She was a third order Franciscan, meaning trying to live the Franciscan spirituality as a layperson. She had 12 children, and during the Second World War, she hid people in the attic from the Nazis. So that was risking her life and even putting her own family in danger. But she did it because of her convictions and her faith. And so I had these examples of faith in my family, but mostly I was spiritually curious, and it was the 90s, and sort of the esoteric, new agey kind of thing was happening everywhere. And so I was interested in many things. But through some friendships, I also got interested in theology and this whole pilgrimage idea, combining what I'd done since my childhood, always having to walk to school and, with the scouts being out and about. I really loved walking. And so going on this pilgrimage was also sort of a test about what my life could look like if I put everything on black. In the casino speak, I guess, or if I don't know if that is casino speak. I've never been, putting everything on God, and it was an incredible experience that was formative and would continue. It was nothing like I imagined it to be. I mean, to be completely honest, I thought that I would just walk to Spain doing this difficult thing, having gotten rid of all the securities and trusting in God, and I would come back as a somewhat illuminated person, maybe even to the degree that I could switch off the lights and still read a book. I was just convinced that this would alter my life in such a way that I would have clarity and certainty for the rest of my years. Spoiler, that didn't quite turn out. Holiness is something that you do not acquire over a summer. But I had many experiences, many encounters that were formative for my future life, which, of course, this is a longer process. There's a long process of studying theology that eventually culminated in me becoming priest.
So pilgrimage and the priesthood have been interwoven for you right from the beginning then.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's even more general. We use the word pilgrimage today in what do people mean when they speak of a pilgrimage as opposed to hiking? And I'm sure you have thought about this on your long walks, because there's a difference when you go on a pilgrimage and when you go hiking, and you can illuminate these differences in a descriptive fashion. But I think you could also go by the definition. We use the word pilgrimage very often in the context of a religious journey. in many different religions, you have pilgrimages, or what we translate as pilgrimages. You have the Aliyah in Judaism, which literally means is a reference to going up to Jerusalem, which is in the mountains, and which was the place that pious Jews at the time of Christ would journey to 3 times a year for the high feasts. You have yatra, for example, in Hinduism and in Buddhism in this area, which means, journey. A journey maybe to a crossing point with some added vocabulary. So there are different kinds of conceptions, but it's usually a journey, or the Hajj, which is also a pilgrimage in Islam that takes you to Mecca. But it literally means journey. There's something peculiar about the word that we use in English or in German and in many of the other languages, which is pilgrim, which comes from Latin. And it actually has a story behind it. The Latin word peregrinus, from which we derive pilgrimage and pilgrim, is a corruption from a root that is per agere, which means through the fields or beyond the fields. And it referred in Roman times to someone who was not a Roman citizen. So the word peregrinus had nothing to do with undertaking a religious journey or not even undertaking a journey. It simply meant the stranger, the one who was not a Roman citizen, the one who was beyond the field because he was not a Roman citizen, he was not part of the community. And the interesting thing is that the Christians understood themselves to be strangers in that sense. They understood their own existence as a journey, as an exodus, if you will, from this world to our true home. So we are strangers in these lands. We are in the world, but not of the world, is the Christian adage. And that is pretty profound, that it became an expression, not so much of an action, of something you do for a particular religious significance, but it is the state of life. And so I think being a pilgrim really means, viewed from its Christian root, really signifies being a stranger, understanding your own life here on earth as something that is not permanent. And then the pilgrimage as an activity becomes a school for living in this way. So I think that's sort of the connection that even goes beyond the priesthood as such, but the Christian life as such. And it has shaped our languages in this way, even if modern usage of the word pilgrimage is maybe a bit broader and wider.
When contemporary Camino pilgrims talk about a pilgrimage, in terms of duration, there's often references to the short Camino, so 100 kilometers, Sarria to Santiago. There's the full Camino, say from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port on the Camino Frances to Santiago. So, about 5 weeks of walking, about 500 miles, 800 kilometers. You blow the scale away with the walks that you have done. Not just that first one, but the one that we're going to talk about is 4,000 miles spread across months. And so it's almost like a mega pilgrimage in terms of the duration, how long you are moving, how long you are away from everything else. How do you think, and I realize it's difficult because you don't necessarily have that same sense of perspective. You were walking really long distances right from the beginning. But how do you think it affects you, changes you as an individual when you are on the road day after day for months at a time, walking basically from dawn to dusk?
Let me just preface this by blowing everything out the water by returning to what I just said, meaning that if pilgrimage really means understanding who you are in this life, you don't actually need hiking boots or sandals or anything for it. So your whole life is a pilgrimage. A vita hominis peregrinatio is the Latin saying. The life of man is a pilgrimage. And so even if you're at home and you cannot leave for Spain or some other exotic destination, if you understand your life in a certain way, you live it as a pilgrim. And so the long miles that I've done, I've come to the end of some of them and entered a monastery, and I became acutely aware that the monks in the same period that I had taken to cross the Alps, for example, had probably traveled much further on a path that was far more important than the one that I had done. So that's just to preface the long walks that I've done. The longest one for sure was the one to Jerusalem. That was almost 9,000 miles and 459 days through 26 countries. I went to Jerusalem and back. I stayed 3 months in the Holy Land and spent the winter there before walking back. I think that was the first real experience of, you're on the road for more than a year, you go through a fuller progression of what this school of pilgrimage can be. And I would say like this: if you go on a very short, if you do the 100 kilometers, the short Camino, for example, and there's nothing wrong with it, people have different reasons for undertaking different things. Maybe people take a week for, I don't know how long people take for this on average. But if you take 5 days or 7 days, well, okay, maybe then it will be on a relaxed pace and it won't be that difficult. But if you go for a longer walk, I think the first stage that most people experience is a physical one. There's a change to your normal life because the life of pilgrimage is far more physical than most of our lives today. Most of us are not woodchucks and are not out and about physically so much, maybe that going on a Camino, coming from an office chair or from some other mode of life that is a bit more sedentary, is a change. And it usually brings about physical pain. If you go for a longer period of time, it will become more of a mental thing. Your body gets used to most things. And I found it incredible, for example, on this long walk to Jerusalem, I wrote a diary. And I had a very happy childhood, no trauma to work through or anything like this. I grew up on a farm in the country. I have good parents and wonderful siblings. At least now I can say they are wonderful. Back in the day, my older sister, but the usual thing. I just came back with her from Sicily, so 50 years on, we are very happy. So there was no trauma, but it was incredible on how many memories came flooding back in with things I saw and I worked through and things that I hadn't thought about for maybe forever, just came back and they became ordered. There is something that walking can do once you overcome the physical pain. Even if you go for the 5 weeks and you allow for some solitary time and not just for the conversations, which are themselves very rewarding and a beautiful thing along the Camino, meeting people. But if you have these periods of silence, your thoughts, this is something that might happen, is they become more ordered. You gain perspective. Some things that you thought were important appear less important. You can mull over things, especially in our day and age with the smartphones where we don't have enough silence. Solitude and silence can be experienced as painful in our society and very often are. And that's the topic of the last walk that I did following the contusions. But solitude and silence are also something that in our day and age are very often missing and are not afforded enough time because we have constant distraction with smartphones. We have constantly a new thing. And so we don't experience enough emptiness that allows our thoughts to flow and process and think about things. And walking can be a very good thing. And so many people find walking or the experience of walking after a certain time something that is structuring and ordering in their thoughts. And that's an old wisdom. The school of Aristotle, the Greek school of philosophy, was called the peripatei, which in Greek means the ones who walk about, because they didn't sit in chairs and were listening to some master, but they walked in conversation, because somehow it seems that our brains work well when there's some kind of monotonous physical exercise. And maybe, I don't know, I can't explain how it works, but apparently people find it helpful. And then when you go on a very long pilgrimage, then something fascinating can happen. Even your thoughts become quiet and you start experiencing silence. And for me, on the way to Jerusalem, the amazing thing really was the desert, where this silence was also very, very audible, if you will, externally. And it was a profound experience of silence. And when your thoughts are not rattling anymore, and you can just listen into this silence, which to me was not an emptiness, not a lack of something, but there was a presence that was more solid than the foundations of the earth, if I may speak a little bit poetically, to the best of my ability in English. I think this is possible if you go through these stages. So there is a certain, I guess sometimes people call it, in action sports, people call it flow. When I talk to a mountain biker and when he goes on these trips, what he's looking for is this state of flow where there's not much thinking and processing happening, but everything just falls into place. And that's a bit different when walking. There's no action that is very dramatic, but there is something you can find yourself entering a silence, a presence, if you will, that is a bit more fundamental.
I could keep talking with you about this all day, but we should probably get over to Columban. Let's talk about this walk that you took in 2022. And let's start with the man, the saint himself. Who was Columban, and why is there a pilgrimage dedicated to him today?
Let me also preface this in a way. When I now go on pilgrimages, and on these long pilgrimages as well, what I look for is usually a story. I'm a priest, but I live in this hermitage. I do a lot of things with young people. I accompany their pilgrimages. I go on scout camps in the summer and all of this. I ended up on this speaking circuit on adventures, and pilgrimage is a big topic in places like Germany. And so I get invited to speak on the walks I've done. And so when I now go out on a pilgrimage, it's less a personal motivation that draws me out there. I'm looking for a story. And I was fascinated by the story of Columban. It's a pilgrimage that I don't know if anyone before me had actually completed these 4,000 miles. I've heard of somebody who had sort of roughed it by himself, but the path is not that old. There's a beautiful website dedicated to it. You can download the GPS tracks, but a lot of them were also designed on the computer. And I know this simply by ending up in a forest where there was no path except on my GPS. And yeah, there was a path. There had been a path like 20 or 40 years ago when there was a logging road or something, but that was all overgrown. So I don't know if anyone else had battled through some of these places that I ended up battling through. There are some shared paths along the way. But the pilgrimage of St. Columban follows the life journey of Columban for a good reason. But to sort of enter the life, Ireland is a fascinating place. Not only people with Irish descent will say that, but it is fascinating also from a Christian perspective, because Christianity spread in the Roman Empire, and it spread also on the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. It later would go on to become the religion of the Roman Empire. And then when in the 5th century, the Germanic tribes and the migration of peoples overturned that whole empire and things started collapsing, Christianity withdrew from many of these areas as well. So places that had previously had a flourishing Christian culture in sort of this Roman substrate lost its footing. That is true, for example, for my own home country of Austria, where Christianity had been present through the Romans. And then with this migration of peoples, certain places were left and were given up, and the church retreated together with the legions. So there was one place that was very different, and that was Ireland, because Ireland had never been part of the Roman Empire. I think there was some plan of a Roman general to conquer Ireland, but then he got a cold and something happened and it was Ireland, so they didn't bother, and it never happened, which meant that Ireland never had Roman roads, cities, any of this. It had a different culture, this tribal culture, which was evangelized by someone who had been a slave in Ireland, St. Patrick, having been robbed by Irish pirates from the English shore. Once he was liberated, he went on to study. He had famously had this dream of having to return to Ireland to preach the gospel. They were calling him. And Ireland became an incredibly fascinating place of Celtic Christianity, which had a different structure also because, again, Christianity on the mainland was still sort of in the ruts of the Roman times. You had cities, and where you had cities, you had bishops, because these were the first Christianity already in the Roman times. And they would sort of the back country, the back places would be evangelized from there on. But Ireland didn't have cities, so it had different structures. Monks played a different role, and the monks were incredibly fervent. And we all know these famous places like Skellig Michael in the Atlantic. And those who don't know what I'm talking about, but know Star Wars, it even became sort of the backdrop for some laser sword stuff. But you have this incredibly rich monastic culture that grows within a century of Patrick's mission. So much so that the Irish would then in turn, once Europe had been sort of completely transformed by this migration of peoples who had different allegiances, or the Germanic tribes that were not baptized or there was no Christianity, these Irish missionaries would come to the continent, and it would become for them a kind of martyrdom, not a martyrdom of a red martyrdom, the martyrdom of blood necessarily, but as they sought the white martyrdom or the green martyrdom, there are different names for these different kinds of choices of leading a difficult life that these Irish people sought to lead. Some withdrew to some island off Ireland, and some others went on the continent and lived among those peoples and brought the faith back and or catechized or recuperated what was lost. And so Columban was one of those who in the year 590, after he had been born and he had trained on a little island in Northern Ireland, he became a student in Bangor, which was a center of the light shining. And this is fascinating. I mean, in the 6th century, 7th century, when people speak of Ireland, people from England, they would go to Ireland to study. And there were places that had 3,000 monks that would be living on, they would have huts from twigs and live in the forest, and they would pray and live a monastic life. So an incredibly rich culture that for centuries would, in waves, send missionaries to Europe. And Columban was one of them who in the year 590 left Ireland, crossed over to a place called Brittany. It was called Brittany because some of the Britons had left Cornwall and some other places for the mainland because they were kicked out by waves of, my English history is a bit hazy at the moment, but could be the Angles, the Saxons, and people moving. And anyway, they basically retreated and formed their colonies in what is now Brittany and called Brittany for that reason. And then from there crossed Normandy and the Frankish kingdom that was there at the time. They were welcomed and allowed to settle in a place which was a former ruin of a town that had been destroyed by the Huns. Attila and his famous Huns had sort of ravaged the place, and these were old Roman baths, and he constructed a monastery there. And this is the first stage of Columban's life, that for a few years he then lived there as a monk. But he came in conflict with the rulers because he criticized certain things. He would not baptize certain people just because it was the nice thing to do. But, he had to lead a certain life. And so he criticized certain powerful figures, and eventually he was exiled. And so he was taken with his band of Irish monks and brought back to the Atlantic, down the Loire River. And this is traced by the Via Colombani. What happened in Nantes, they were looking for a ship to send these Irish troublemakers back to Ireland. And Nantes is sort of a little bit inland. The Loire is a river estuary which the ships would navigate. But the ship that took them on stranded on a sandbank. And for days it would not move. And so the captain, tried to understand the reasons for being stuck like never before. He just tried what would happen if he took the monks and put them off the boat. And, miraculously, the boat drifted off to sea. And the Irish were back on the mainland, not shipped off. And so they made their way back, not to the monastery where they initially were, but they decided to go further south. They did some missionary work in present-day Austria and Switzerland in that corner, but eventually made it across the Alps and founded the last monastery where St. Columban died, in Bobbio, which is in the Apennine Mountains. And the abbey would become an incredibly important center. The Irish monks, one of the reasons why they became so instrumental is the preservation of knowledge through dark times and troubled times. The monks in that period were the people who preserved knowledge by copying texts. And so there are many texts we only have because monks preserved them. And the Irish were famous for their incredible manuscripts and the styles they developed, not only the proficiency, but also the beauty of their works. We still have works like the sacramentaries that are preserved that are incredible. There was even one monastery that was sacked, and the only thing that one of the monks could save was a book, but it was a book, and he would take it to the next monastery. And so the monks became crucial for Europe by preserving knowledge and preserving the faith and instructing the faith. So that was something that I wanted to explore on this pilgrimage, looking at the different things we could, not only by looking historically at what the monks did and their journey, but then also looking at some of the things we maybe could learn from the monks today.
Through no fault of your own, it is a befuddling journey to follow because, most pilgrimages are designed to get from point A to point B in the most efficient manner possible. People are trying to get from their homes to that important site. They're not trying to take the scenic route over mountains unless those are also, pilgrimage shrines of interest. But eventually I had to set your book down and bring up a map to figure out what on earth was going on, because this is a pilgrimage that, because it's following the journey of Columban, it goes in a full circle, a loop-de-loop. It's like a a child scribbling with a crayon, this route that you followed. Was that a special kind of challenge moving through an itinerary that is so circuitous? Or was it helpful for you given that you were focused as much on inserting yourself into a narrative? And did that then facilitate your immersion in the life of Columbine?
So, yes, it looks like a child put a crayon to the map. It was actually God who put that crayon to the map.
That's fair point.
From my theological perspective. And as it happens, God likes to draw wild circles, even in our own lives. At least that's how I look at it. So, yes, I think the challenge in being immersed in the life, one of the challenges is that even though you're following the route and you're visiting places like Tours, where we have the life of Columbine was written rather early in the 7th century by one of the people who still knew Columbine. And so we have a pretty good idea of what this journey looked like and where they stopped and what happened. And even though it's a work of hagiography, which might have some things that have more of a theological significance than a historical reality, we gain a lot of things and insights into what happened along the route and that they stopped, for example, in Tours. Tours is a place where St. Martin of Tours was bishop, and St. Martin is a very popular saint, and he's known for different kinds of things that are associated with legends that are long after Martin. But Martin was an incredibly fascinating figure. He was the one, he built the first monastery in the West. So he's the founder of monasticism in the West in the 4th century, when this idea of the desert monks came. And obviously Columbine, when he passed the city where this bishop was buried, he wanted to pray at the tomb. And so we have this account of how he spent the night there. And other places along the way where they were taken in, for example, by a woman, a Syrian woman. And you would want, how does a Syrian woman get to this? I forget if it was Orléans or some other city along the Loire River. But then you do some research and you find out that, yeah, I mean, we even have camel bones from the Roman times, because the Roman Empire, Syria was part of the same empire than this part of Gaul. So you have fascinating stories that you can enter into, and it's immersive in that sense that you follow the place. And you're right, it's different from maybe a pilgrimage like to Jerusalem or to Santiago or to Rome, where the destination is really the thing you're aiming at. And as in old days, pilgrims would probably have like intermediary destinations. There was, for example, the Abbey of St. Giles in southern France, when this became a major pilgrimage thoroughfare. People diverted from ancient routes to go through that monastery to also visit the relics of St. Giles and pass through this he was a saint very popular in the countryside. And so you have this sort of more aimed at a destination. And following the life of someone is a bit more squiggly, but it affords you also to think about things in the life of those people that you follow and things in your own life. And so there is a particular way you enter upon a journey that follows the places of life of a person, but it's not always harmonious, because you might have a few days where there's nothing really that is connected with that saint. But other interesting things that along the way that you think about. It's much like life itself, where every day we do many things that are connected with our daily activities and this, but there's maybe an overarching thing that we are trying to do, or we are trying to learn, or we're trying to grow in. And so it's more points along the way that receive renewed focus on this particular thing. And so, yeah, I think that's the challenge, but also the beauty of this particular kind of pilgrimage, where you follow the life's journey of a person. And I've done other since. I've done the Way of St. Martin from Hungary to France, which sort of visits important places of his life along the way. And the one that doesn't exist, but I made to exist, is following St. Bruno, the founder of the Carthusians, from Cologne to Calabria last year, which was topical. So it was, the Carthusians are these monks who live in silence, who seek solitude. And there's this tension that I've already alluded to, that silence and solitude are a thing that for many people are cause of suffering. I mean, even some countries like the UK even have a minister for loneliness, Canada too. So there's this fragmentation of our society where people feel more and more alone. So it's something that causes suffering, and yet it's something that other people seek. And we all human, so there is something that is different and yet connected. And so to explore this and meet people along the way and think about loneliness that has many different faces was sort of the aim there. But again, following the stations of the life of St. Bruno and sort of approaching it from this angle. So there are different layers, I guess, and these layers are interwoven with my usual complaints and sufferings of, like horse flies and all the other things that pilgrims will recognize from their own adventures.
Horseflies are rough. I understand the pain. You know, one of the layers that stood out to me reading this account, and it is reflective of my own experiences walking in France, is the destruction of so many once beautiful and important and sacred buildings, abbeys, monasteries, churches, all ravaged by the wars of religion, the French Revolution. And one intellectually understands that it happened, but to see this long chain of devastation day after day, week after week, it must leave a mark on you. What did you take from that steady exposure to so much wanton destruction?
I mean, two things. One thing that for me was an experience that made me reflect on something that I learned on my journey to Jerusalem was that in Jerusalem, crossing all these different countries, where neighboring countries, I walked through Russia, Ukraine before the war. I walked through Georgia that had been in a war with Russia. I walked through Iran that obviously nobody could know that I was going to Israel. So you have all these different complicated history. You have Armenia and Turkey. I crossed Armenia from north to south. An amazing, beautiful country, but no diplomatic relations for 100 years since the Armenian genocide in Turkey, or in what was then the Ottoman Empire, and where Armenians lived in many of these areas. So the fascinating thing for me, it was an outside look at many conflicts where you realize that many of the wounds that people carry are not experienced but inherited. You inherit hate for someone or something. And I found myself walking through Ireland, for example, and then reading all these stories of churches being burnt down with the people inside by Cromwell when he tried to, well, whatever Cromwell tried to do. But or in England that I crossed, and you have all these abbeys that Henry VIII, because he really, really wanted to marry that other woman, and as it turns out, then many other women. So you have all these human elements, but I realized at some point that I was getting angry at the things that I'd seen, because I identified with the Catholics, obviously, but I'd never experienced any of the hurt. You have to look at people, and you have to look at the historical context, and you have to look at all the intentions that people have, and the good and the bad and the ugly that is in there. We sometimes forget that we all, in our own history, we are all the children of murderers and rapists and whatever pillagers and plunderers that lived generations before us. There is no innocence in humanity. This is something that, I can be Austrian and I'm proud of Mozart or something like this. Yeah, but there are many things I cannot be proud of as an Austrian. So there's this human element that I became aware of walking through these places of destruction, that I had to try to gain enough distance to not wrongly associate it with whatever a personal fate or something like this. You can feel sadness, but in the end you feel sadness for both the one who suffered the destruction. And, in the wars of religion, it went both ways. Massacres happened this way or that way.
Sure.
And the Catholic cause was certainly very often as politicized and in the wrong as the other. So you walk through these things, and it's a reminder that, for me at least, it became a reminder that in my own judgment of things now and things surrounding me, I should be very cautious in attributing both malice, and you try to see it, learn it. And one of the things that for me as a priest is I don't stop being a priest being on a pilgrimage. It's something where celebrating Mass, offering the sacrifice of the Mass, praying at these places, which in my faith is bringing Christ to places. This was very evident on my way to Jerusalem, where I would say Mass at places where for hundreds of years, though there had been Christians before, now it was a Muslim majority. And I would be in these caves or in these other places where once it was a different culture and things happened. And to go there and to shine the light of Christ, just like the warming rays, as I would look at them, into these situations, is there's an aspect of atonement for the injustices that happened by trying to make acts of love, the greatest of which in the Catholic perspective is the sacrifice of the Mass. So to have these things to celebrate at these locations where so many bad things happened, and it doesn't matter who did them, but to sort of put the cross there, the sacrifice of the cross right there. This is something powerful and has been powerful for me. So yeah, there's a priestly dimension for me as a pilgrim and as a pilgrim who is a priest. And then there's this personal dimension of where I realized that I myself can get drawn into sort of this tribal nature of things where if it's Catholic, then this is my tribe. So these are my people. And if it's the others, then it's the others. And one has to be very cautious and very careful in being tribal.
Your reflections just now made me think, you, over the course of the narrative, you spotlight a series of lessons that we can learn from Columban and his fellow monks. And the first one I think that comes up was to aim at a high ideal wholeheartedly and yet to see people in their weakness as they are. And I think that speaks in part to some of the sentiments underlying tribalism, the fact that we, on one hand, can focus on our purity that is entirely incomplete, and on the other hand, view others as fatally flawed because they fall short in one particular area, and learning to reconcile both ends of that judgmental spectrum is a challenge, but one that we have to navigate.
Yeah. Sorry, that was not a question. I agree.
No. It's something I glommed onto that lesson because it's something that I see. I'm a high school teacher. I see young people struggling with this idea of aiming towards a high ideal, as though ideals themselves have progressively become invalidated, as though they have been exposed for being deceptive, that the hypocrisy that runs through so many institutions and so many leaders has fallen short of that goal. And so when they fall short, the ideal itself becomes questionable and in some cases harmful as something that is leading us astray or manipulating us. How do we get back to a point where we can have shared upon high ideals that clearly lead us towards, I'm not religious, but I still see the value in collectively shared ideals that lead us towards pro-social behavior and common values that are to the collective good. And I worry that we have lost a lot of that.
Yeah, I think there's a disillusionment with institutions, and I'm not shouting anything new here if I say that the Catholic Church is at the forefront of well, rather sad and very horrible disillusionment that people experienced. But then I myself, this is something that when I was on my pilgrimage across the Alps, the Via Alpina Sacra, which took me to 200 shrines in the Arco Alpino, it was another 2,700 miles, visiting all these places and trying to tell the stories of these places. I also found myself at some place in Switzerland reading the news, and there was yet another scandal. But then there was one that somehow personally touched me because the person that was involved, it was no children, it was a grown woman, but it was a case there was a connection to my own personal life. I didn't know the person, but I knew the place that the person had been in, and nothing happened at that place. But I must have shared the same pew, the same library, the same, university building. And then this person went on to study in Rome, and there was a priest who completely scandalously behaved. And there was all these, she had all this faith and all these good intentions and all these high desires and following this ideal, and the priest twisted it to make it subservient to him. And I got so angry that it was actually very fitting that the sky was black and there was like thunder and lightning. That was my interior state for the whole day. And the next day I walked up to Grand Saint-Bernard, where the highest monastery is, the place where the Bernardine dogs come from. And so I had this long ascent and I was still fuming. And it was only when I entered that building and was taken in by the monks in the most kind and charitable way that it took me out of this wallowing over my anger. And priests go to confession, and I had a lot. My thoughts had been very, very violent and angry. Anyway, and I sometimes have the impression that in the Catholic Church there is not enough of that, because any father who has children, if something like this happened to their children, the father or the mother would rightfully act in a certain way. And if I'm called a father as a priest, then I better be upset about the things that happened in the Catholic Church, and anger is the appropriate response. The problem with anger is that anger can also take over, and in my case, it completely took over. I was so angry for 2 days. And so being received in this particular way by the monks at the Grand Saint-Bernard was healing, because it showed me there's an ideal and people aim for that ideal and people fall short of that ideal. And I myself fall short of that ideal. I did fall short of it all the way up to that monastery, because I was angry, and I think I was rightfully angry, but I was angry in a measure that was becoming very destructive to my soul. I'm being angry at the imperfection of other people while being very imperfect. So I think we have to distinguish the ideal from the human weakness. And this is, I think, another point that I write about, that I take from Chesterton in that Columban book, in the following Columban book, which has to do with the utopian thing that people hope for, which is sort of a man-made paradise that we can arrive at if we do things right. And I think here all religions have an insight that is far superior, namely the fundamental flaw and weakness of humanity. And so to think that we can build a society that is completely different because we just by our own will and strength overcome our weaknesses and our faults, I think the utopian ideal that has, communism is an utopian idea, and it's one that led to the death of dozens of millions of people wherever it was tried. And it's an ideal. It's an ideal where people work together and own things in common, and things that are not that foreign from how monks live in some ways, by having common possessions and sharing work and all of this. So ideals are important because we have to aim for the good. But then we have to extend the grace that we all fall short of the good. And so I cannot throw out the baby and with the bathwater. The ideal has to be looked at as what it is. And if it's true and good, then it ought to be pursued. The only problem is if the ideal is actually something that is itself false, meaning that it doesn't correspond to reality. If a true thing is something that corresponds to reality, then a false thing is something that is different or does not correspond to reality. And I think the problem of a utopia is precisely that it misrepresents human nature, that it misrepresents who we are. And therefore, we think, for example, that technology will solve our problems, and chances are it will not. I mean, not chances. It will not, because it does not change who we as human beings are. Yes, we can have better weapons, we can live longer, but with better weapons, we just kill more efficiently. And if we live longer, we just do bad things longer. So I think the technocratic approach, the utopian approach that trusts in the power of man is doomed to fail. And I think these are the failures that have to be recognized, that we don't have to restore. There's no point in repeating utopian thoughts that are destructive. So I think since most religions have been around for a very long time and have known and have expressed humanity, I obviously as a Catholic think that the Christian anthropology is the most profound, which doesn't mean that others get everything wrong. It just means that in the light of Christ and the gift of self on the cross, the anthropology changes who God is and how man relates to God. There are some peculiar things that I hold to be true about the Christian faith that make this story one that I think shapes humanity in a very good way, which does not mean that the ones who tell the story don't use all the means and methods that are very often counterproductive. I mean, if you're I don't know if you're a parent, but any parent who is listening will know that your 2-year-old will ask why for a very close to infinite amount of time. It's a number that cannot be counted. And there comes a certain point where you just, you try to explain something and the why question comes. And at some point you just take a shortcut and you say, well, it's like this because, or why should I do this? Because I say so. We take shortcuts. And if you have power, then it's even easier to sort of use that power to take a shortcut because we mean well, but the victories we win may end up being Pyrrhic victories because future generations will look at these victories and see them as loss or as a betrayal of the very thing that you were trying to conquer. So in this sense, I think if you're a teacher, how do we look? Let's just be very honest about who we are as humans and then extend grace to our fellow men. And that's difficult because, again, tribalism makes us reduce people to this or that. And yes, it's true, we sometimes act stupidly and maybe sometimes deserve a rash word. And I look at myself in conversations where I maybe say something that is too short and too quippy and maybe a bit too meant not to help someone, but to win an argument rather than winning the person. We sometimes do this. And so, yes, it's right to criticize it. But again, distinguishing the ideal from the reality that we fall short of. And this is something that is not a new idea. When Christ talks about the distinction between sin and the sinner, there is a fundamental distinction there. Because the sinner is viewed as still a child of God, someone who is created and meant to enjoy the communion with God, even though he currently is not. So you cannot hate the sinner. Your hate would be directed also against the one who desires the good of this person, and that's God. So you cannot hate your neighbor and love God. That's the Christian ideal that we fall short of, but it's still there, and it doesn't change because I or every other priest falls short in this respect.
I wanted to finish with shifting maybe more from the bigger picture back to the personal, because this is a long account, as deserved by a long journey. I think it's about 370 pages, and it concludes. And then there is a half page afterword that almost threw me for a loop. It's the biggest thing I wanted to ask you about. At the very beginning of the book, you write that your goal for the walk is that it is a challenge to my weaknesses, my impatience, my low tolerance and suffering, my cowardice, my fighting spirit. I want to learn to fight from the Irish monks, to be St. George. In the afterword, you write, the honest answer is that I had repeatedly failed along the way. My capacity for suffering had proven to be low. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who gets to that point who has read about the very consistent 30 plus mile days that you were putting in week after week after week. And of course, the horse flies, and many nights spent in a tent, very few days where you could enjoy a proper shower. And I'm thinking your capacity for suffering has been remarkable. So what was it that had you feeling that sense of failure at the end of this?
There's a difference between fighting and being. So you can fight and be at peace, and you can fight and be not at peace. And I don't mean with a sword or anything like this. But if you go through a struggle, the aim is not just to go through the struggle and conquer whatever obstacle there was. But for me, the aim is to remain in virtue while I struggle. And that is, I think, very evident on many of the pages through the complaints. And I try to use humor mostly. And it's self-deprecating because it's deserved. You can walk 30 miles and win the day if you wish. And you can reach your destination after many miles. But again, it's not about externally arriving, but growing in an internal way. And I think both of these things are compatible. I finished the 4,000 miles. And I would like to say that I've become more patient on account of it. I know that I didn't. But then again, for me, pilgrimage is And aiming at these things is sometimes just a way to more concretely become aware of what I lack in my day-to-day pilgrimage journey, which is the big pilgrimage, the one that we are all on, whether we wear hiking boots or not. And so sometimes wearing yourself thin on these days and realizing that, for example, before I went on long pilgrimages, I never thought that I was impatient, because my daily life had these ups and downs, and it was all cushioned by friendships and this and this and this and the comforts of the day. But if you remove the comforts, if you remove the closeness to people who give you support, sometimes the meaning that you derive from doing a certain thing that for you is valuable and important, removing yourself from all of these things, you sometimes realize the skin is getting thinner. So the highs get higher, the lows get lower. Many people describe this also when they walk the PCT or the AT or something like this. You remove certain things in your life, and pilgrimages in that sense also serve as an honest look at yourself. And so, yeah, that last page unfortunately was necessary, because while I did, in an external fashion, conquer the path of Saint Columban, my journey, and with the particular aims that I started with, was still not complete and still isn't 3 years or 4 years on.
Do you ever think that one day you're going to walk a pilgrimage correctly, and then you'll be done? You will have prepared for that metaphysical pilgrimage ahead, or is this a lifelong pursuit?
I believe it's a lifelong pursuit. My first grave error on my very first long pilgrimage was precisely that I thought I could attain sort of a state of sanctity, and then I would cruise on a cloud through the rest of my life, giving benedictions right and left, and having the right answers for someone in need, and having overcome my flaws. That was my 20-year-old self, a utopian dream, I would find out, and it would be horrible if I thought I had achieved it, because then all motion would cease, because I would no longer aim for anything. Even if I conquered some of this is the interesting thing. If you look at the lives of saints, Saint Ignatius of Loyola is maybe a famous one. You know, having gone through all his life and having done this and this and this, and then having changed his life and changed his life as a soldier, and then becoming this soldier for Christ in a different sense. The longer he lived, the more frequently he shed tears over his own imperfections, because the more acutely he became aware of it. I don't think sanctity is anything that is like a state of being in this life where you're sort of like a guru who just has the answers. The closer you come to God, the more your own imperfection is before you. So there will be more tears, there will be more contrition, there will be, and I'm not saying this because all my tears and yapping about horseflies is just an indication that I've really progressed towards God. I'm saying this as a novice. Even after many years, I've been a priest for 22 years. I'm still step by step trying to walk the very same path that others who try to follow the path of Christ have walked. And nobody who has gone very far would ever say that they have arrived, for the simple reason that if ultimately the end of it is a loving union with God, nobody would ever come in this life to a state where he would say, I have loved enough, both God and his creation. Because our finitude. And so our heart can always be enlarged. We can always grow in that sense. And in fact, it seems to be very often the opposite. If you ask people who do not lead a spiritual life, and you ask them, have you done something wrong? They will tell you, well, I haven't killed anyone, and I haven't done, I've stolen, taxes really are theft. So if I don't declare all the things, then it's all okay. It's like when you love someone, the more you love someone, the more sensitive you are to his wants and his needs and his desires. And so the way you relate to that person, it's almost when you are not in love with that person that it's more difficult, because you go like, we have a good relationship. It's all fine. So it's getting closer that will actually show you the depth of the abyss that is between a creature and the creator. And so if I do things right, I will never come to a place in this life where I will say, enough, I have loved enough. And I'm far from any place even in that direction. So, and again, many miles to go. even if they don't have to be spent walking, but on an interior path.
And sometimes it is on a Columbine-like journey. So it's not always a straight road, unfortunately.
Oh, there it is.
I
Yeah.
saved the most important question for last. Do you ever get tired of dairy products?
Well, having had my book and I flipped through the pages, you know that 75% of my body are technically fromage blanc, which is sort of this mixture between a cheese and yogurt in France that is served there. I've eaten it to such a high quantity that it, I think, has chemically altered my substance. But I'm a very simple person. I grew up with the best kitchen ever. My mom had learned cooking that was her profession. And being Austrian, of course, sweet dishes, cakes, and all kinds of things are. My mom loves experimenting with this. So whenever I'm home, this is awesome. I get the best food. And then when I'm on the pilgrimages for months, I live like a barbarian. I just eat. Even walking through Italy, it's almost. I read about these wonderful dishes and but I don't have the money to either buy them and I'm quite happy and content just eating bread and cheese and yogurt whenever it's available.
You make a reference at one point to 5,000 calories. And this is one of the ways that the really long pilgrimage changes you, that your relationship with food shifts. It becomes tiring sometimes having to pack in all of the calories to get you through for the next day. So yeah, your mind shifts from quality to quantity. And sometimes what's the most efficient calorie vehicle so that I can just move on to other things for a while.
And I have the worst habit. I drink water every day. And I love water. Since I was a kid, if my mom would want to give me hot chocolate or something, I would despair. I needed cold water for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's true now too. I drink water by the buckets. But on pilgrimages, the amount of sugar liquid, cola basically, or whatever, because if you have to try to get to your calories, you can't eat them. You have to drink them because otherwise you'll never get there. And so the amounts of ice cream or cola that I consume, and since I don't drink coffee, for me, even the caffeine of cola is gives me another boost. That I can even see it in the statistics. So if I track myself on the GPS, I can see the cola bump, the ice cream bump, by the speed going up. And yeah, I think it's not advisable. Anyway, it's the body just burns, and this is true for hikers, I think, who walk the PCT or the AT or the CDT. You try to get calories, and sugar is great stuff.
Thank you, Johannes. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And I've only made it through one of your books so far, but now I know that I need to move on to the Via Sacra next. And I look forward to reading about that journey as well.
Well, thank you very much for having me and chatting. And I'm looking forward to read about your own projects, especially the walk across America, which to me sounds really fascinating because it's in meeting people. And you contrasted this in the conversation we had before I think you started recording. It's looking at the country as a whole and looking at the individuals, fascinating and exciting, or sometimes maybe even depressing. It's seeing people. I think that's what all pilgrims, the encounters, the meeting of people, that can be one of the great rewards.
Have you ever noticed how when someone says that another person made a really interesting or insightful or important point, it happens to align with something they also agree with or feel passionately about? It's a self-compliment, really, saying that another person's brilliant observation only serves to extend our own beliefs. Well, I offer that framing because I'm about to do the same thing. When Johannes talked about how he seeks out a story when planning his long-distance pilgrimages these days, it aligned perfectly with something I've been thinking about a lot lately. The quick and easy definition of pilgrimage is that it's a journey occurring within and without. There's an external pilgrimage, the walk itself, and an internal one. This is why, for example, Johannes could believe that he had completed the physical walk, but failed at the internal journey. Both are critical halves of the larger whole, and maybe that internal one is more important even. As I've pushed onto longer distances and away from the nicely self-contained journeys on long-established, clearly defined, and well-traveled pilgrimage routes, I've realized that there's a third layer to pilgrimage that matters to me, and it's the idea of a narrative frame. I have to believe that I'm inserting myself into a larger story, something that links my journey in the present to something enduring, something important. It needs to feel relevant to me now, but link me to some larger human tradition or idea or experience. If you think about it, the Camino de Santiago is powerful to many today, not so much because of the literal journey to St. James's theoretical remains, but more as a consequence of the layers of stories that have accrued. Roland's defeat, the fountain of wine, dancing chickens, singing nuns, El Cid Campeador, the bleeding host, the cross of forgiveness, the last Templar, and the end of the world. Those stories transform the walk into something profound. And it is through the personal engagement with those landmarks, anecdotes, and legends, and also through the link they forge between you and all the other pilgrims who have visited those places over the years, who will visit them in the future, that a deeper meaning is constructed. It's one of the reasons that I think it's a shame when pilgrims don't try to learn a little about the history of the places they're passing through. Not just because it's interesting in its own right or a good practice as a traveler, but also because that knowledge can help forge a more substantive experience. By accessing a greater story, we can enrich our own. That's all for this episode. Thanks again to Johannes Schwarz. You can find him online at 4kmh.com, and you can find his books, including Following Columban, a pilgrim's 4,000-mile quest for monks' meaning and the meaning of monks, as well as Via Alpina Sacra, the longest pilgrimage across the Alps, online. All episodes of the Camino Podcast can be found on Spotify, Apple, SoundCloud, and YouTube. You can reach me at CaminoPodcast@gmail.com and through the Camino Podcast Facebook page. And you can support the pod on Patreon at patreon.com/Dave Woodson. Back again soon.